A young woman who gives birth to a little girl high up in the tea mountains of Yunnan. She must give away this baby, and then that baby is adopted by a family in Pasadena, California. I write historical novels. When you think of that plot line right off the bat, it's sort of just the last 30 years during the one-child policy, so it doesn't seem terribly historical in the way that I had written before in the 17th century or even in the 1920s and 30s here in San Francisco. But so I was looking for something that I could use, and I ended up using the Akka ethnic minority, the history of tea, and of course the one-child policy. But I really think that my books are less about history and culture than they are about relationships and emotions. And so for this book, it's mothers and daughters, and the emotion really behind it is mother love. All right, so the Akka ethnic minority have a saying, which is, no coincidence, no story. And in fact, this book starts with that sentence. But it also was a series of coincidences that led me to write this story. So the first is that my husband and I were walking down the street in Santa Monica, going to the movies, and I saw up ahead of us an older white couple walking with their teenage Chinese adopted daughter between them. And she had her hair up in a ponytail, and as she was walking, it was swinging back and forth, and I thought, oh, she's like a fox spirit in that family. And in Chinese tradition, fox spirits can be very naughty. They can be very, troublemakers. They're always sneaking into the study at night where some scholar is working really hard, studying for the imperial exam, and then having sex with him. So they have this tradition of being, like I said, naughty and mischievous. But in their best incarnations, they can bring great love, and they also have this ability to create families. And so when I saw these three people walking, I thought, this is what I want to write about. This was something I had been thinking about for a long time, but as soon as I had this vision of her as a fox spirit, I knew, yes, this is the next project. And so I started doing some research, and I was, researching about one-child policy from the China perspective, but also what's happened with this wave of young women who have come here. About 3 months later, and again, I'm still thinking, what's the real historic backdrop? About 3 months later, I was doing an event down by San Diego in this it was a huge event for a library, and they had brought in someone to do a kind of opening act with a Chinese tea pouring ceremony. And I got to sit up on the stage with him and taste all of these teas. And I'm sure many of you have seen Japanese tea ceremonies. It's very, very formal, very stylized. Not with drinking Chinese tea. It's very messy. There's tea going all over the place. There's water going all over the place. The cups are overflowing. And it's so messy that you actually have a table that has little holes in it, so all that sloshing water and tea can go down through a not very cute plastic tube into a bucket, okay? And this tea master was talking about the history of tea in general, that, tea is the second most popular drink in the world after water. And he started talking about this one particular tea, pu'er, in Cantonese, it's pone. And that this one area of Yunnan is the birthplace or the starting point of the tea horse road. And so and just before I get to that sort of, these tea shrubs, when you see tea shrubs, whether they're in China or Japan or Kenya, or you see them in a picture, you've been there yourself, you see all of these shapes. All of those tea shrubs, no matter where you go in the world, have all been manicured and cultivated and cloned down into that shape. So every single tea shrub you see like that, anywhere is a clone. But in Yunnan, they still have the original tea trees, and some of them are 30 feet high, 70 feet high, and people still go up into them and pick the tea leaves. And from this place, which was also the starting point of the tea horse road, people would take these packs of cakes of tea, 150-pound packs, and they would lead out from this tea horse route into three main directions. The first was they would walk overland to the capital where they gave the tea as tribute and tax. The other was that they headed out 1,000 miles overland to Tibet. And they were walking through rain and snow and heat and humidity. This was a trip that took anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, 1,000 miles again, up and down all those mountains. And as they were walking, this tea began to change. It began to ferment. It wasn't alcoholic, but it did change its nature. And so by the time they got to Tibet, it had really turned into something else. And that tea is still the main part of the Tibetan diet today. They mix it with yak butter and barley and drink about 30 cups of it a day. And the green part, the tea part, is the only green part of their diet. That tea also went in a different, one thing I forgot to say, which is that they would trade that tea for war horses. So that's where you get the name, the tea horse route. All right, the other direction they went was out towards Hong Kong and Guangzhou. And Hong Kong, Guangzhou, very hot, very humid, lots of rain. It's also known for having fabulous food. It's where dim sum is from. And so, a lot of that is kind of greasy. Dim sum is known to be kind of greasy. And so people would drink this particular tea that had also changed and fermented down in these basements to kind of cut through the grease. And so people, over time, would go to particular restaurants, not for the quality of the dim sum, but for the quality of the tea from that particular basement, because whatever else was in that basement would infuse into that tea. China closes, now you can no longer buy it, but those restaurants still had huge quantities down there. And it starts to grow in value, and it's growing, and 10 years, 20 years go by. When Hong Kong was handed back over to the People's Republic of China, there were many people who sold off their collection of pu'er to finance their moves to the United States. Anyway, he gets to the end by telling this one story, which was that just that year, so 3 years ago, at international auction, 1 cate of this tea, a little under 1 pound, had sold for $150,000 US. And I thought, as soon as I heard that, I can use this. I can really use this. So I started doing research about tea and about pu'er, and I'm minding my own business and working hard. And my husband is on a board, and there he had a board meeting, and somebody else on that board said to him, "So, what's Lisa working on these days?" And he said, I don't know, something about tea. And Choy asked, "Well, is it pu'er?" And he said, "I don't know, it's something about tea." And so this man wrote to me that night and said, "Are you writing about pu'er?" Because just the week before, he and his wife had been at this big Chinese banquet where he had been seated next to a woman who's the largest importer of pu'er into the United States. And did I want to meet her? So off we went. And she doesn't speak any English, and so we actually met at another woman's house who's fluent in Cantonese and Mandarin and some other dialects, as well as English. And so she, Linda, owns her own pu'er company that's mostly all online. And we spent the day drinking this tea, and it's a lot like going to a wine tasting. You know, you taste one, and then the next one, and the next one. So the first one was raw, and then 1 or 2 years, 5 years, 30 years. The last one, just the liquid alone, about 2 ounces, was worth about $1,000. Oh. And so by this time, I had already planned my trip to China. I was going to go during tea picking season. I was, going to go up into the tea mountains, and I had a sense of where I wanted to go and some people that I wanted to meet. But at the end of this day, I asked Linda, I'm going on this trip, and is there anyone that you would recommend that I should meet, or anywhere you think I should go? And she said, well, I'm going to Yunnan for tea picking season. Why don't you just travel with me? And so off we went. Now, a couple of words about Yunnan. Yunnan is known as a global biodiversity hotspot, and that means a couple of things. First, there is more plant life in that one province of China than altogether in the rest of the northern hemisphere. There are more species of animals in this one province of China that only takes up 4% of the overall landmass than altogether in the rest of China. And then that biodiversity also applies to human beings. So China has 55 ethnic minorities in addition to the Han majority, who make up 95% of the population. Of those 55, 26 of them live in Yunnan. And so off we went, and I was thinking, I knew I would have an ethnic minority in the book. I had written about the Yao ethnic minority in Snowflower and the Secret Fan. So, I'd sort of whittled down from those 26 down to about 5, but I went kind of keeping an open mind. And when we got there, what can I say? People, I think today often think of China as being a global economic superpower. Well, not in this area. It's still very remote, very hard to get to. And so we were driving up these one-lane dirt roads, high up into the mountains with these, huge cliffs coming down. And sometimes we would see people way up on the mountain picking leaves, and we'd stop the car, hike up there, and just talk to them and find out about their lives and what they were doing and what ethnic minority they were from, just chatting. We would also just stop at houses that we saw and just go in and talk to people. They might be, feeding the baby or peeling vegetables for dinner, or washing clothes, and we'd talk, and they would say, oh, why don't you stay and we'll have some tea, and we'd drink tea, and then they'd say, oh, why don't you stay and we'll have lunch, and we'd say sure, and then they'd crack a chicken snack and pluck the chicken, and anyway, there came this day that we met with an Akka family. The daughter was about 30 years old, and she really reminded me a lot of myself. She loved to ask questions, she loved to collect stories. And so she began telling me stories about her mother, about her grandmother, about other people who lived in their not their village, but their part of the mountain. And by the time noontime came around, I knew that I would be writing about the Akka, and we spent several more days together. So the Akka are really interesting. They're a nomadic tribe. They roam between Myanmar, Laos, northern Thailand, and then this one province of China. They're animistic. They've been described, that their culture has been described as being very similar to the Cree here in the United States. They have their own language. They celebrate their own New Year, which isn't Western New Year or the Lunar New Year. They celebrate follow a 12-day week. The women wear these very elaborate headdresses that they work on for years, that some of them weigh up to about 20 pounds. They have silver and coins and bones and feathers, and I don't know where they get them, but these little fluffy pom-poms. And let's see, what else can I tell? They also have, some of them are still so high up in the mountains, so remote that they still haven't learned about clothes yet. And this area itself is still so remote that they only got electricity 10 years ago. So at one point I asked Abu, what was the first thing your family bought when you started to make money? And of course the first thing was electricity. And I said, what was the first thing you bought for yourself? And it was a washing machine. And I think the women here can appreciate, not having a refrigerator or some of the other modern conveniences, but a washing machine is a must. And so they also have their own interesting myths and legends and healing practices. One of them has to do with their origin myth. The great mother, Amamata, who had 2 breasts in front and 9 on the back. The 2 in the front were to nurse her human children. The 9 on the back were for her animal children. And so you can just sort of take a step back for a minute and think about how that might play out in society and culture. On my website, I have a section called Step into the World of the Tea Girl, and I have videos there of the Akka, all kinds of information about tea, a whole big section on my trip, Let's see, a lot about the one-child policy and, of course, transnational adoption. We've designed a how to have your own tea tasting book club, so it has, book club questions, but also you can get a little pack that has 3 different kinds of pu'er that you can try with your book club. Anyway, you can look at all of that yourself. So this story begins with a little girl, 7 years old, Leon, who wakes up about 2 hours before dawn. She has breakfast with her family, a very simple breakfast of a soup made out of water, basically, and weeds, and then they hike 2 hours up into the mountains. They pick leaves all day, and at the end of the day, another 2 hours walking along the crest of the hill until they get to the tea collection center. And once they're at the tea collection center, Leon meets another little boy named Sanpa. They get into some trouble, and then the 2 kids are brought together, and the parents are trying to determine, should we do a healing ritual of the 2 kids together, or should they be separated? And everything depends on what day of the week that they're born. And it turns out that Leon was born on Pig Day, and Sanpa was born on Tiger Day, and the whole world knows that tigers like to eat pigs. So not only do they not have a healing ceremony together, but they're forbidden to ever see each other again. But of course, you wouldn't have Romeo and Juliet if they didn't see each other again. So they do see each other, and it is true that Leon ends up pregnant and having this baby high up in the mountains under an ancient tea tree, and then having to walk down into the city for the first time to leave her daughter. And that gets you to page about 75, I think. It's safe to say that Leon's story actually follows this wave of what happened to pu'er in real life and how it came out into not only out of the mountains, but into the rest of China and then across the globe. And so then meanwhile, Haley. So Haley, over there in Pasadena, she's too young to speak for herself at the beginning. And so when you first see her, and hear about her, it's through the eyes of other people. The person who runs the orphanage where she's left and who writes a report about her. The specialists who see her when she first comes to the United States because she's so ill. Later, emails between her adoptive mother and grandmother. But finally, you start to hear Haley in her own voice, a birthday card that she's written to her mother. Spelling words that she does in 3rd grade with spelling sentences, which I'm just going to be totally frank and tell you that I totally cribbed from my own son's spelling lesson or spelling tests that I've kept all these years. And then finally to this point where there is a chapter that is a kind of transcript of a group therapy session for teenage girls who've been adopted from China. So why is it that this matters to me? Why is it that this wave of girls is so interesting to me? I grew up in a very large Chinese-American family in Los Angeles. I think many of you know this story. My great-great-grandfather came here to work on the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. My great-grandfather came and stayed, and he became kind of the godfather patriarch of Los Angeles Chinatown. He got his start selling tickets to see a stuffed mermaid. His first business was in Sacramento in the 1880s, where he manufactured crotchless underwear for brothels. He was the first Chinese in America to own an automobile. He had 4 wives, one of whom was white, and that's the family that I'm descended from. In my family today in Los Angeles, I have about 400 relatives. There are about a dozen that look like me. The majority are still full Chinese, and then this spectrum in between. So how is it that we identify ourselves? We identify ourselves by the people who are around us. They're our mirror. They're the ones who tell us who we are. And so, my inside doesn't match my outside. So when I talk to these young women, and I'll tell you how I found them later, when I talk to them, so many of them had these similar kind of conflicts that for many of them, they had been adopted into white families so that they were the only Chinese face in that family. We live in a very diverse, you all live in a very diverse city, we live in a very diverse state, but in our other parts of the country, they might not be only the only Chinese face in their family, but also in their school, in their church, in their synagogue, in their community. And so they've struggled with this sense of, am I Chinese? Am I American? Am I Chinese American? Or am I something else? So I knew a lot of families, I've known a lot of families, including my own, that have adopted, not my own, but within my larger family, who have adopted girls from China. But I wanted to go out and find others across the country. And some of them I met completely by happenstance. I was doing a book event in New York City when two young women came through the line to get their books signed, and we started talking, and they volunteered that they'd been adopted from China. And I asked them, can I send you some questions? And so I did find several young women all across the country who volunteered to answer my 12 questions. What I got back from them were these letters, 30 to 50 pages long. They completely opened their hearts to me to talk about their experiences, to talk about how they feel about their identities. They have struggled in many ways. They've been raised in these families that they're so precious, they're so loved, that they have wonderful opportunities for education and life, but there's still this part that's hurting and missing. And so much so that they actually have their own label. It's the grateful but angry adoptee. Over time, I came to look at it a little differently, that it wasn't grateful but angry. Rather, it was grateful but sad. And this was really summed up for me by one young woman who wrote to me, you know I'm the most precious person in my family. I know it. But I wasn't precious enough for my birth parents to keep me as their one child. So I've written a lot about mothers and daughters before. I think this is my deepest mother-daughter story yet, or story about motherhood. If you've heard me before, you've probably heard me talk about this Chinese concept of mother love, a written character that actually combines two elements. One part means love, the other part means pain. When I was working on Snowflower and the Secret Fan, I thought, I get this completely. A daughter would look at her mother, the person who was binding her feet, inflicting really terrible, terrible pain in the name of love. Of course, that's it, love and pain. But of course, you don't have to have your feet bound by your mother to have her torture you. I got that. But later, by the time I got to Peony and Love, I had begun to think of mother love slightly differently. That it wasn't about how a daughter looked at her mother. It was really about how a mother looked at her children. And I thought about my own experiences as a mother. I remember when my older son, Alexander, was just a tiny, tiny baby, and he got sick for the first time. It was an ear infection and one of these terrible fevers, and I had him on my shoulder, and I was, walking through the house in the middle of the night, pat, 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 and he was, really not looking good. And I just remember thinking, if only I can get through tonight. Of course, I didn't realize then he was going to learn how to drive. And so here's the thing, your kids, they grow up, they go off to college, they get jobs, they get married, they have kids. Their kids can't stand them, their wives leave them, they lose their jobs. Real life happens to them. But what can we do at that point? We can't take our grown children and put them on our shoulder and go pat, pat, pat. And so this made me think about my second son, Christopher. When he was in college, he was deeply, deeply, deeply in love with the young woman I affectionately call the evil Jenny. The other night, someone came up and said, we had one of those in our family. We called her Satan's sister. So I know this is not just unique to my family, okay? So anyway, I happened to be visiting him right after this happened, and I'm sitting on his bed in his dorm room, and he was just heart-busted, really, really heart-busted. And again, what can you do? I couldn't take him and walk him down the dorm hallway and pat, 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 So pretty soon you hear these really stupid things coming out of your mouth, like, oh, honey, there are other fish in the sea, or, and I did say this, I'll kill her for you. And I was like, but Mom, I love her. Anyway, so that was part of this evolution. Well, 12 days before the final edits for this book were due, my mother was diagnosed with cancer, and she died 10 days later. And my mother was a writer, and, the book was due, but my publisher was really terrific, and they kept saying, writing to me, take more time, don't worry about it. But I actually, before I left to come out on tour, I went back and looked at that correspondence, and the day after my mom died, I wrote, my mom, whose entire life revolved around writing and the love of words, would be happy to know I'm finding calm and solace in those very things. And I did finish it on time. But it was still a few months later, as page proofs were coming and the copy editing and all of that, that as I looked back at this book, I could see that actually over the last couple of years that in that kind of way that art can do this for you, my heart and mind had been working in this very mysterious way to explore mother love in a whole new way. And so every single person in this room, somewhere along the way, did have a mother. And maybe you knew her and maybe you didn't. Maybe you liked her and maybe you didn't. But all of us share in that experience. And, maybe you've already lost your mother, maybe you haven't. If you haven't, it's going to come, I hate to tell you. But, when that does, all you can do is take that love and pain and carry it in your heart. So, I just want to end with saying a little bit about how I feel about books and reading as a reader first. I love books when you open them up and you step into another world and you explore other cultures and time periods. I love all of that. But I also love when you open them up and you are connecting to characters, whether they're real or imagined. And what is it that we're doing when that happens? We're thinking, what would I do in that situation? How would I feel in that situation? To me, what that's about is that we're really trying to connect to, in this larger way, about what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be part of humanity? I just want to thank all of you for reading my books, of course. I feel so fortunate that every day I get to sit down and open my heart and share it with all of you. And I'm just really grateful that you come along for the journey. Thank you. So we have a few minutes to have questions. I guess if you raise your hand, I know somebody has a microphone, but it's such a small place. I think if you raise your hand and say the question, I can repeat it for everyone. Yes?
Hi. So when you're not writing, what kind of books do you like to read?
When I'm not writing, what kind of books do I like to read? Well, that's the key, the when I'm not writing, because when I'm writing, I won't read any fiction. I'm very superstitious about it. I always think I'm sort of like, the quarterback who wears the same jockstrap for the entire season. This is a total superstition, but, they believe it. And I do have this sense of I don't want other voices, anything like that coming into my head, even inadvertently. And, I am writing, for the most part, about a different culture, so I can't be reading some hard-boiled detective story when I'm writing about the Akka and Yunnan. So I really feel like I have to kind of close myself off and protect myself. When I'm writing, I do read a lot of unpublished dissertations about the subject that I'm writing about, or I'll read poetry about something that I'm writing about, or short stories that, let's say, for Shanghai Girls, there was 1930s in Shanghai, there were some of the greatest writers in the history of China were writing right then. So to read them in that moment sort of put me in that time frame. So again, I read a lot of stuff that probably even the writers' mothers didn't read. but I'm reading it, so that's a nice thing. When I'm writing, I also, but of course, as soon as the book is done, I read everything on the bestseller list because I'm just curious. Like, why is that girl on a train still on the bestseller list? I still don't know the answer. I read it. Right now, I'm reading, what is it called? The Hidden Life of Trees, and it's written by a German forestry manager. It's been a huge international bestseller, and each chapter is about 4 pages, and he is talking about all the ways that trees communicate with each other. And it's just, every single chapter has some piece of weird scientific information that I just love. So the last chapter I read, he said that it not just can't be a managed forest, but in a true wild forest, 1 scoop of dirt off the forest floor has more living organisms in it than in the entire population of the planet Earth. And I just went to bed happy that night. I like that. Yes?
But what happened to the fox?
So what happened to the fox girl? So here's, for a long time the book was going to be called The Fox Spirit of Hummingbird Lane, and I had a whole plot that went with that fox and the whole origin of the fox spirit. But the Akka don't have a fox spirit in their culture. And so I was like, well, I love the Akka, but it was very hard. And I kept asking them, don't you have anything that has like fluffy tails? They didn't. So there went the fox spirit. But nevertheless, I carried her with me all the, that image of her, that young woman, all the way to today. Yes?
Yes. Among your book, who's your favorite male character?
My favorite male character, I think, is Sam from Shanghai Girls. He's Pearl's husband, and he is such a brave man, but humble, but also very brave, and deeply loves his wife and daughter. And at the end of that book, he does something that's truly heroic. It's one of the saddest things, and I've written some sad things in my books, really sad, but that one, what happens to him, that just really killed me. For about 3 months, because I'm writing it, I was trying to figure out, how can this not happen? How can it not happen? And he's caught up in the whole confession program during the 1950s, and he does something that will save his family. And so he's, by far my favorite. Yes?
What is your fond memories of people like Mr. Choy before they passed away?
So what were my fond memories of Mr. Choy before? He actually, 100 years ago, I worked for a magazine called Publishers Weekly. I was the West Coast correspondent, and I covered everything west of the Mississippi. And on I think it may have been my first trip to report on publishing in the Bay Area, I had lunch with him and with Philip Choy, Mark Lai, and Judy Young. And all 3 of these people are so instrumental to the creation of what we now think of as Chinese American history, the way that they collected materials, the way that they've interpreted materials. But this was right during the publication of the book of poetry from Angel Island. So that was the first time. And then the last time was when I was working on China dolls. And he told me these wonderful stories of when he was a little boy trying to sneak into different theaters. And one of the stories he told me was, these shows could be a little, again, kind of naughty. There were bubble dancers and fan dancers. And so they would try to sneak in backstage, right, these little kids. And there's this kind of curtain, right? But there's also a back curtain or things that you can peek out of. So that he and this other little boy peeking out, to see the back side, the naked side of the band dancers and bubble dancers. And so to hear him tell those kinds of stories from his own childhood were really wonderful. All right, thank you all so much for coming today.